So my paper today is called How Can Historians Apply Contemporary Ideas on Whiteness as a Visual Label to Earlier Periods of Time. So to begin, in the Oxford English Dictionary, the following definitions of whiteness can be found. Whiteness, a noun, can mean lightness or fairness of complexion, especially when regarded as beautiful or desirable. Light skin color, especially in a person of European origin or descent. The state or condition of being white, conceived in terms of racial or cultural identity. And finally, moral or spiritual purity, stainless character or quality. So these meanings are not concerned with the visual appearance of whiteness, neither the chemical application of light pigments on canvas, nor white skin as a color on a spectrum. They concern identity and what is attached to the state or condition of being white. But what is whiteness, and how can our understanding of how whiteness operates in contemporary British society influence our understanding of visual culture in periods past? The study of whiteness as a formal discipline is closely tied with developments in the 20th century concerning the fall of European imperialism and the ex-colonial states it left behind. But while what we call whiteness studies or critical whiteness studies only emerged in the 1980s, people of color have been defining white identity for much longer. It's what Hooks refers to as a, quote, special knowledge of whiteness that could only be gained through close observation and the lived realities of Black and brown people. Discussions of whiteness by non-white scholars have long centered on notions of power and white supremacy that existed and still exist to maintain rigid racial hierarchies at home and abroad. So writers like Baldwin saw the rise of whiteness studies among Black people as a method of survival in the face of white terrorism. I should also say there is a trigger warning for this presentation, just for outdated racial terms. So just as prominent was the idea that whiteness would cease to exist if it did not have an other to compare itself to, a racial control that could tangibly reflect the advantages Europeans were prescribing upon themselves. So Fanon wrote, "The settler is right when he speaks of knowing them well, for it is the settler who has brought the native into existence and who perpetuates his existence. The settler owes the very fact of his existence to the colonial system." So Fanon wrote these words at the height of the Algerian War of Independence, exploring the relationship between the colonizer and the colonized, as well as the dehumanizing experience of the post-colonial identity. These ideas were also explored in Black Skin, White Mask. The Black person enslaved by his inferiority, the white man enslaved by his superiority alike behave in accordance with a neurotic orientation. Both of these ideas situate whiteness in a cyclical manner. In the fabrication of the other, whiteness fabricated itself. However, they extend far beyond whiteness. The power structures that it engages with on an institutional level are also of concern, for not only is whiteness itself a crucial thread in the fabric of European self-identification, but it also often acts as a shorthand term for other identities that have intersected for centuries in the context of modern imperialism, notably Western and Christian. In his book Orientalism, Said emphasizes this repeatedly, but argues that Western identity also hinges on the removal of the other's agency. That is, the East, as well as being a physical place adjacent to the West, had to operate symbolically in a way that could be made Oriental by the West to maintain a fluctuous relationship of domination and subordination. Thus, the Orient then seems to be not an unlimited extension beyond the familiar European world, but rather a closed field, a theatrical stage affixed to Europe. In this sense, the stage of the Orient, with its brown-skinned people's non-Christian belief systems and, quote, lack of civilization, can also be used as a two-way mirror to reflect the symbolic construction of Western identity back onto itself. Not only does the Western colonizer rely on the colonized East for existence, but they must also prescribe a set of ideas and impose them onto it to embody and inhabit that existence. Some critics of empire were also acutely aware of this paradoxical existence. In Shooting an Elephant, Orwell believes that the white man becomes a sort of hollow posing dummy, for it is the condition that he shall spend his life trying to impress the natives, and so in every crisis he has got to do what the natives expect of him. So neither Said nor Fanon explicitly set out to define whiteness in their works, but in writing about the colonized, they established frameworks to conceptualize how the colonizers could be viewed through a non-white lens. This eventually saw the emergence of texts in the 1980s and 1990s that treated whiteness in the same critical manner colonists had been applying to the category non-Western for centuries. That is, whiteness as a state of being or something constructed that didn't exist before and needed to be explained. The methodologies and approaches adopted by these thinkers varied greatly, but their aims were more or less similar: to recalibrate the centrality of whiteness and destabilize the objective neutrality that is placed upon it, both politically and aesthetically. So far, these attempts to strip the facade of whiteness have been categorized into one of two broad groups: the historical approach and the experimental approach. Chen's description of these is particularly succinct. Historically oriented scholars examine the historical roots of whiteness and tend to understand whiteness as fluid. And white scholars tend to adopt the experimental approach, in which they view and analyze whiteness as a social condition of white people that needs to be acknowledged, exposed, and ultimately resisted. Rodiger notes the emergence of whiteness as a means for differentiating between the immigrants arriving in the United States, notably among the white working class eager to prove their Africanness against Black slaves. The idea of the white European immigrant emerged gradually, and populations previously not considered white were slowly incorporated into a growing political identity that relied on the idea that there was one homogeneous European race. Thus, the state, as Chen writes, created conditions that rewarded the abilities of Euro-ethnics, which enabled European immigrants and their children to secure white status. Alongside the observations noted down by scholars like Omi and Winant, who formulated the racial formation theory, this analysis lies at the heart of whiteness studies and is necessary if we are to decode the hegemonic sway the white race holds over Western culture. Since early modern imperialism, the idea of the superior and inferior race has been developed and weaponized, not only to ensure non-white advancement towards civilization, but also that is Western advancement to the position of Great Britain and other white Western colonies. Richard Dyer's seminal text, White, was one of the first to use these theories to examine the role of whiteness in visual culture and how it perpetuates the normality of the white body. Not yet. As well as the connections to imperialism, he relates the notion of the white self to Christianity, since it becomes the religion and the religious export of Europe. His examples reach back much further than his peers, back to the racially charged views of Christendom during the Crusades. More pressing, however, is his analysis of whiteness as an aesthetic quality that has the ability to control its own narrative, as well as the narrative of the other, in such a way that Western racial hierarchies are maintained without uttering a single word. And he writes, in a visual culture, social groups must be visibly recognizable and representable. So theoreticians of whiteness provide us with ample evidence of whiteness and its consequent socio-political advantages. Equally as important, however, is defining whiteness through anecdotal evidence provided by writers of color that may or may not engage with theory, but more readily defines the visibly recognizable quality that is described by Dyer. Perhaps the most agreed upon observation is that whiteness equals neutrality. As Painter puts it, the useful part of white identity's vagueness is that whites don't have to shoulder the burden of race in America. A neutral racial identity is blandly uninteresting. Aside from the political benefits mentioned previously, being white provides one with the benefit of not having to think about race, or when race is confronted, the ability to distance oneself from it when the confrontation is over. This extends to discussions about race. Neutrality is a loaded state that allows contemporary whiteness to dismiss post-colonial criticisms of whiteness. To be able to ignore race, and by extension whiteness, is, as Painter puts it, understood to be a graceful, even generous liberal gesture. To notice is to recognize, and that is an already discredited difference. So there's also been a growing number of British scholars taking part in these debates in the wake of increasing public awareness of issues that were primarily seen to be exclusive to the United States or other European empires, such as police brutality, colonial genocide, and slavery. What they argue is that there is a specific brand of British whiteness that is particularly adept at concealment and subtlety, which is part of the reason Britain has not fully reconciled with its racial past, particularly in comparison to Germany. Akala sees a number of reasons for this. He writes, first, Britain never practiced open white supremacy on domestic soil as it did in the colonies. So those of us who hail from the colonies have a different understanding of British racial governance, even if we were born here. Second, the most deprived and violent regions of Britain remain areas that are almost exclusively white. Can the white people who burned to death in Grenfell Tower, along with the ethnics, be said to have had white privilege? So for many writers, Britain's time as an empire was a critical period for the codification of whiteness at an institutional level. Said places the beginning of a regulated ideological concept of us and them in the 18th century, and Colley also sees this period as the birth of British nationalism and identity in the face of internal European enemies and external indigenous populations. That's not to say that Britain did not exhibit racialist attitudes before empire. Rather, it was this period that formulated new scientific, anthropological, and archaeological methodologies that allowed them to formally justify long-existing proto-racial thought. Throughout empire itself, there's no shortage of evidence that demonstrates the relationship between British whiteness and imperial expansion. Charles Dickens wished he were commander-in-chief in India. He wrote, "I should do my utmost to exterminate the race." And Winston Churchill supported the slogan, "Keep Britain white," in the face of Caribbean immigration, and, quote, did not really think that Black people were as capable or as efficient as white people. A particularly strong strand in the fabric of whiteness that still informs contemporary political discussions is the idea of the white race, which developed during empire. While Enlightenment ideas of human unity were quickly becoming popular, the Eurocentric models applied to them inevitably meant that some races came above others, with whites naturally sitting at the top. So Richard Bradley in 1721, for instance, claimed that there were 5 types of men, starting with white Europeans with beards at the top and Black people with curly black hair at the bottom. This was later expanded upon by Linnaeus, who said that the European race were governed by laws, with Asians governed by opinions, and Africans governed by immorality. Likewise, Charles White placed different races at different stations in the great chain of being and attempted to prove that different people had distinct origins, in a manner similar to Christoph Meiners, who split the humans into the beautiful white race and the ugly Black race. These racial theories were quickly weaponized by prominent figures to justify both the need for British expansion and Britain's divinely ordained duty to colonize people of lesser races. For Enoch Powell, one of the enduring principles of Englishness was its racial homogeneity. Never said that word out loud, so I don't know how to say it. And Dr. Lawrence Waddell thought invading Tibet was inevitable, for they were enemies not only of ourselves, but in some sense of the human race. When we as a country look back at our imperial history, the theories and ideologies explored above are neatly glossed over in favor of a vision of empire that was wholly good in its civilizing mission. A day trip to any major British city is evidence of this. In Edinburgh, Henry Dundas occupies the central space in the new town. In Bristol, until very recently, Edward Colston was placed on a pedestal, and Frederick Roberts sits proudly on his horse in Glasgow. All of these men were directly or indirectly involved in the slave trade or profited from plantations across the Atlantic, and they are not the only ones. As such, quote, our collective amnesia about the fact that we were, as a nation, willfully white supremacist and occasionally genocidal, and our failure to understand how this informed modern racism are catastrophic, end quote. A series of YouGov polls conducted over the last decade or so provides a glimpse at the relationship empire has with the British general public. A poll from 2014 found that 59% of respondents saw the British Empire as more something to be proud of, with a poll from 2019 showing that 33% of respondents believed that countries colonized by Britain were better off for being colonized, with 27% answering yes to would you like Britain to still have an empire. Another poll from 2019 shows that out of 7 countries in Europe, Britain came in second after the Netherlands when asked if participants were proud of their empire. We cannot say, however, that this is particularly surprising. The British education system has repeatedly failed to introduce the topic of empire to classrooms, instead ensuring children know the names of the wives of Henry VIII in chronological order, or that we Britons single-handedly defeated the Germans in both world wars. This selective history filters out all mentions of empire. In 2007, Britain celebrated the bicentennial anniversary of the abolition of slavery, but failed to mention that for almost 400 years it dominated that very same slave trade and fought hard to reinstate slavery in several Caribbean islands. In 1961, Ian MacLeod, the Secretary for State for the Colonies, denied newly independent colonies access to imperial documents that might embarrass the government. And as recently as 2012, an inquiry found that thousands of imperial documents were destroyed as they were due to enter the public domain. Bringing up this problematic history quickly invokes the fight or flight response towards empire, since it challenges the image. Have I got this on the quote? Yeah. Because it challenges the image that we have of ourselves as a nation which abolished slavery. Racism exists everywhere, not just in Britain, and empire feels like a long time ago. Likewise, Puri believes that it is far easier to comprehend the 6-year event of the war than it is to take in the empire, which was a 5 centuries long state of being and of mind. From Clark and Garner's study, it's clear that notions of white supremacy have been reconfigured, with the events from September 2001 and July 2007, and now Brexit, standing as significant markers in the evolution of race relations in Britain. Unlike in North America, nationalist movements in Europe have long centered on the plight of the indigenous population, that is, white Europeans. According to Nick Griffin of the BNP, the indigenous people of this island are the English, the Scots, the Welsh, and the Irish. We are the Aborigines here. And several right-wing groups invoke the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People to confront immigration. A further look at the responses to immigration by the general public shows that the issue is widespread. In one of the survey results from Clark and Garner, someone said, "I'm just fed up with all the British that aren't, the non-British that are now British. That sounds like I've got a racist problem, but it isn't." Or English goes back to Norman times, whereas British might be a British subject from the Caribbean. I just feel that English is somewhat older and somewhat purer and somewhat more filtered. These examples highlight several important facets of contemporary white British identity. There's a prescribed set of our values that are under threat from outsiders, with propaganda invoking the image of loss. The idea of the nation is intrinsically linked to genealogy and cultural homogeneity. You must have both to be considered part of the we. And there is the assumption that integration is not enough to make somebody British. One has to assimilate completely. But what does this have to do with visual culture? What I have outlined so far is how unstable a category like whiteness can be. Throughout the centuries, it has meant different things to different people in different places, and as such cannot be considered as one homogeneous identity. What this also means is that as a visual label, there can be a staggering variety of interpretations of it. Critical whiteness studies only emerged in the 1980s, but scholars have been identifying instances of the scientific white race since the late 18th century. Now, other scholars have been finding traces of whiteness in periods long before 1700s. In the long history of colonization, power and subjugation have lied at its heart, and white skin as a marker of a Western Christian identity has existed since the Middle Ages, however fleeting. Thus, labeling whiteness in Renaissance Italian art will not be the same as labeling whiteness in the French Caribbean colonies, which itself won't be the same as labeling whiteness in contemporary settler states. But whiteness is still there, so when we construct a label like whiteness, we have to both adopt the critical approaches that are being informed by contemporary socio-political discourse, but also make it compatible to that scientific time period. So how can we do that? For the final section of this paper, I'll try to reconstruct or construct a working model of whiteness that takes into account its highly unstable nature. There cannot be one single definition of it, but I hope that the interrelated facets I describe convey the complexity and nuance that working models require. So, first, whiteness is a socially constructed demonstration of power that adapts to the society that needs it. It can include and exclude, as well as be dismantled and rebuilt at its will, but it must be built using contemporary socio-political frameworks. Secondly, using Gramsci's model of cultural hegemonies, whiteness is not controlled by everyone who benefits from it, but rather by the state, through which the ruling class not only justifies and maintains its dominance, but manages to win the active consent of those over whom it rules, thus presenting a series of ideological norms that support aristocratic values. Third, for whiteness to exist, there must be an exclusion of the other to mark the advantages a white race holds, as well as the works of Said and Fanon, and reliant on Strauss's theory of binary oppositions, since, quote, classification only ceases when it is no longer possible to establish oppositions, end quote. This is particularly important because whiteness relies on its own narrative that actively distances itself from that which it is not. Finally, whiteness must be visible yet invisible, or even neutral, in the public imagination to maintain narratives of power. This invisible representation can occur in media, but also occupy cultural and political spaces in order to control the carefully curated image of the other. If the other occupies too large a visual space, quote, a different type of insecurity is triggered by being momentarily caught out of place socially than by physical threat, end quote. Working models must, of course, be constantly revised, but approaching whiteness in such a way can better convey the nuances of whiteness before it existed in its current form. So to conclude, not every society will project whiteness using all four aspects, or even at the same intensity. But what I hope to have shown in this paper is that when applying whiteness to earlier periods of time, it's necessary to both understand how and why we are approaching it from our 21st century perspective, as well as making it historically specific to convey the contemporary cultural complexities that inform such identities. In approaching whiteness in earlier time periods, we are responding to the concerns of the present. Thank you very much for your time.